All right, everybody, what's up? Welcome back. So this is round two of my discussion with Derek. So let's just get things started. Why don't you just remind everybody who you are, what you
Sure.
do, all that stuff, and then we'll dive right in.
Great. Yeah. Great to be here again. Thank you very much, Lance, for taking the time out of your very busy life to discuss these things with me. I am a learner, especially when it comes to this topic. I do have my doctorate in philosophy. I teach philosophy at university. I publish and research and so on. I even have my own YouTube channel. Of course, some people might know. But my research specialization is you get very highly specialized in a certain area, and my specialization is not this. So we're always learning. I bring a certain kind of background here, certain kind of back. I have a particular set of skills, as Liam Neeson says, have been taken, but they are not skills that, are well, they're naturally fitted to this, but I don't have the background knowledge. So I'm still learning a lot. I think these discussions with you, Lance, are really, really awesome. So yeah, do you want to jump in here and take it from there?
Yeah, sure. So we are going today to go over some of the various topics that you wanted to discuss with me
Yeah.
surrounding meta ethics and our different perspectives on the matter. So I'm an anti-realist. You have watched some of my videos.
Mhm.
You've seen some of what I've had to say in various contexts. It is one thing. It's a bit hard because I'm not. I haven't written a book. I haven't
Mhm.
written out this
Right.
programmatic sketch of like, here's my views in some sort of logically coherent order. And you're not the first person that's like sort of taken bits and pieces of what I've said in different
Yeah.
scenarios and tried to stitch together a coherent picture.
Cool.
So
Yeah.
I have had people ask for that, and it's certainly something I'm going to need to do. What I should say is that for me, although so my area of specialization is actually the psychology of metaethics, and more generally in in the sort of at the intersection of philosophy and psychology, and in particular the question of when we're asking questions about philosophy to people that don't have training in philosophy, how do they interpret those questions? What kinds of philosophical views, if any, do they have? And how do those views map onto, or how much of an analog are they to the views that philosophers have? And I'm very much of the view that this needs to be handled case by case. It very well may be the case that people without training in philosophy, they certainly have some philosophical views that I'm very confident they do. They certainly, many of them believe in God. That's a philosophical position that you could take. It's not like you run out and do a scientific experiment. And even then, I would think that science is in a certain ways subordinate in some ways to philosophy anyway. So it's not like I think if you're doing scientific research, you're not in a way doing philosophy. In any case, other ones, it's not, like, do people have different views about the fundamental nature of time? I don't know
Mhm.
about that. So I come at a lot of these questions with a very heavy dose of psychology, maybe a bit too much, and that informs my views on the matter. But for a lot of this stuff, it's still very much a matter of exploration for me. I think it would be a pretty sad thing if I thought that I had everything settled now. I very,
Yeah.
very, very much do not. There's so many areas that intersect with metaethics because you have questions in
Mhm.
metaphysics and epistemology, and of course in ethics more broadly speaking.
Yeah.
Metaethics connects to normative ethics and applied ethics. It connects to views about language. So
Mhm.
uh, because it's at this sort of intellectual crossroads, you can't be a master of all of those things.
Mhm.
And in many of those areas, I'm a novice,
Mhm.
and this is it's a complicated topic that I think superficially gives people the misleading impression that it's pretty straightforward. It's obviously objective. It's obviously not. I'm on the anti-realist side, and I still get frustrated when I see people say moral claims are by definition subjective.
Mhm.
No, they're not. Come
Right.
on.
Yeah.
So you get people saying this on both sides. People think these things are easy. They're not easy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm going to make mistakes and not know things myself, and it's good to be reminded of that. Too many
Yeah.
times when people have these discussions, people are way too overconfident that they have everything pinned
Mhm.
down, and they don't.
It may just because you have this warrior-like mentality, you're gonna go, die on this hill for your view, and I don't have that approach with respect to this. I wanna explore these things, I'm interested in truth, I'm curious about these things, I think I have a view that is right, but I'm running into, some curiosities or some difficulties or some internal inconsistencies or what have you, or maybe some new novel objection that I hadn't thought of before, or I thought I had the other view figured out, and turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. So as you continue to, and I appreciate the humility because we all have blind spots. Nobody's going to be a master of all these things, like you said. But if you don't mind, Lance, you mentioned something there about methodology that maybe we can start with, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You said that, of course, you're informed by that sort of methodological, empirical approach through psychology to these meta-ethical issues. And you have done a lot of research on what people say about what they self-report about. And in fact, you can say more about this than I can, but when they discuss these things, as you've taken that position, I've not read your dissertation, but I've heard you discuss, here and there in pieces, what you've mentioned about this sort of your quietist, this folk, meta-ethical relativism, correct me if I'm wrong, that people take this idea that there's really this indeterminacy. They don't really have the categories, meta-ethically speaking. They either don't understand the question or they're using normative categories to describe what they think is answering the questions. And they turn out they're very, very confused about these things. Now, but I've also heard you say that you think that the empirical approach is the best approach because, for lack of better terminology here, sitting in the ivory tower, sitting in the philosophy armchair, perhaps isn't the best way. You're going to have this sort of, it's almost like Platonist versus Aristotelian. Aristotelian wants to get out there into the world, see the real objects as they are. So I can appreciate that approach, but you seem to suggest that by just thinking about these concepts without interviewing people leaves one very, very limited as a researcher because you need to go out there, you need to see how people are using this language. But I wonder, this is with that setup. Now here comes the question. With that seems like not an outright contradiction, of course, but seems like I'd like you to iron out this inconsistency for me because you want to go to the people, but the people don't know what they're talking about. You see what I mean? So is that the right method? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So it really depends on the kind of
with the result.
It depends on the kind of question philosophers are asking. If the question is, are there stance independent or objective moral facts? I wouldn't rely on what non-philosophers, people without significant formal training in philosophy say on the matter.
Mm.
So often when people talk about what experimental philosophers are up to, and at least in their early days, they kind of gave this impression. They gave the impression that the empirical approach to these sorts of questions is to ask people without training in philosophy what they think. And if a majority of them endorse a view, then you conclude that the view is true. That would be absurd. I mean, you wouldn't do this for the sciences. Why would you do this for philosophical questions? Like I wouldn't survey people on their views about like the correct account of physics and then go, look, 93% of people, when you describe Newtonian mechanics to them, think it's ridiculous. So Newton wasn't onto something, or give them general relativity or something. They're not going to know what you're talking about. But the question that philosophers will sometimes try to answer is the question of what non-philosophers think. So there's a different question. You have one question, are there stance-independent moral facts? And the other is, do people think that there are stance-independent moral facts? Or when they speak, do they presuppose that there are stance-independent moral facts? The only claim here that I'm saying is in a straightforward sense, amenable to direct empirical inquiry, is the latter set of questions, the questions of what do non-philosophers think? And unfortunately, in metaethics, if you take all of the standard sort of stock views for both realists and anti-realists, what is moral realism? One of the key theses or pillars of it is cognitivism, that when people make moral claims, they're making propositional claims. And two, that those propositional claims purport to describe stance-independent moral facts. And then they pair those claims about what non-philosophers mean when they say things with the metaphysical thesis that there are such facts. So they have a kind of semantic condition, and then they have a kind of success condition, which is people are trying to say there's objective facts, and there are objective facts. They don't just say there are these objective moral facts. Who cares what people are saying? And this applies to the anti-realist views too. Expressivists, non-cognitivists. Moral claims are not propositional. What moral claims are they talking about? Are they talking about ethereal moral claims in the Platonic void, or are they talking about the actual things people said? The same for error theory. Error theory says when people make moral claims, they're trying to be realists, but there are no facts of that kind, so they're all wrong. Relativist, when people make moral claims, they're making claims about their preferences, the standards of their culture. So it's central to the current contemporary analytic approach to meta-ethics to make these sorts of claims about what moral sentences mean, about what people mean when they say things. And that's the question where I'm saying the empirical questions matter. And
Okay.
if it
Got
turns out that non-philosophers don't have views on these things, or there isn't a determinate semantics to ordinary moral discourse, then we got to get rid of those semantic theses from all of these views. Like they should
Yeah.
not be a part of it.
Yeah.
And what I would say, you might think that's going to cause a huge problem. I don't know that it does, because the nature of reality is not contingent on how like people, English speakers happen to speak the English language. Like it isn't. And so I think that this points to a deeper issue in analytic philosophy, which is this warped relation that analytic philosophers have between language and reality, where they seem to think that you take this language first approach, where you look at what people are trying to do with language, you presume that their language has these robust metaphysical components to it. And because you say, okay, well, that's the common sense view, it's presumptively true. We assume that when people speak, they're referring to certain sorts of things. We're going to assume those things exist unless we have good reasons to override that. And I think that that entire approach is misguided, and that you could go directly to the metaphysical questions without looking directly at what people mean. So there isn't an inconsistency here, because when I'm talking about the empirical stuff, I'm only talking about the question, what do non-philosophers think, or what do moral claims mean?
Mhm.
That's a separate question from, are there facts of the relevant kind?
Okay. Totally makes sense. So would you then advocate if there is some, indeterminacy in how people speak about these things, if we really can't get clear about that, if they're just all over the place, if they don't understand the questions, if then we should just sort of abandon that semantic thesis.
Yeah.
When you could just sort of just take a realism, let's suppose. I mean, it makes you wonder why realists seem committed to the semantic thesis, or committed to cognitivism at all. What do you think that's doing for the realists? And if they were to abandon it, like, what would they lose?
One thing they may lose is presumptive arguments in favor of realism. So this is something that a few people have written about. Neil Sinclair has a great paper. I think it's called Facts, Values, and Presumptions. And there's a more recent paper looking at certain aspects of our language. One of the big sort of rhetorical and dialectical feathers in the realist cap is, hey, I've got the common sense default
Yep.
everyday normal view. It's the anti-realist that has the totally bonkers, weird, skeptical view that rejects the way that things seem. And I think realists lose that. They lose the ability to say, our position is the default position. The onus is on the anti-realists to show that their position is correct. Now, is that losing a whole lot? Not really. So all that would do, if they reject that, is put them on an even playing field with anti-realism. And if realists are confident about realism, that's not that big of a problem.
Yeah.
At least it shouldn't be.
It sort of shifts what they thought was the burden of proof. Now there is no burden, like you said, even playing field. But let me ask this. So with respect to the presumption argument, this presumptiveness, so I've thought about this recently, not always. It just sort of occurred to me that as I was thinking through some of your interviews and streams lately, that when you were discussing these empirical studies, maybe the study, the survey of academic philosophers, the 62% who are realists, the 65% who specialize in meta-ethics who are realists. You mentioned this, so you've got statistics here, and then you've got other statistics in the work that you do in your research that purport, but also I think what Enoch appeals to this, humor I think appeals to this as well. The everyday, ordinary, common person, let's say non-philosopher, folk, if you will. These I wonder if they've misidentified who it is that they should be after. So there is common sense, and then I think perhaps maybe we should create a new category that says this it should be this pre-philosophical common sense. This idea that let's interview and survey philosophers and then ask them what they thought before thinking about philosophy. Because I think even humor was like, yeah, when you study a little bit of philosophy, he said this in your interview with Big Tim, anybody would, I think, acknowledge this. Once you've had a little bit of philosophy, it's sort of, you start to think differently about these things. So I think maybe a little flaw, and what the cutoff would be, because you have to have a little bit of, you know, a little bit of insight into these terminology and concepts to be able to like make the distinctions, of course. But then, what would be the cutoff? What do you think about that? Like that philosophers, maybe what they're appealing to is not just your average everyday person on the bus, on the street, that has never thought about these issues, but they might actually be appealing, when they say common sense, to what would be a pre-philosophical understanding. And this would include philosophers who, yeah. Has that ever been mentioned in the literature?
It has. So there are people that have addressed this, and
Mm,
I think well, not we, I should say me,
mm,
or people that take the critical approach I have to presumptions in favor of realism. It would be a mistake for us to insist that Enoch or Humer or anybody else has this incredibly naive view that what we're looking at are these, I think it's what Competent calls surface intuitions, that
mm,
what what they are claiming would be something as silly as whatever people would immediately say unasked, with no reflection and without any regard for whether they're understanding the questions we're asking or whether they're competent judges of the matter or anything like that. Um,
right.
I don't think many of them think that way. And as an indication of that, you could look at what people have actually said about what they're talking about when they're talking about intuitions and what they're talking about when they're talking about the kinds of judgments that concern them. Anti-Competent has a great paper on this called The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. Now, that paper came out, I believe, in 2007. So it came out pretty early on. And it was, I think, experimental philosophy is often attributed to this paper from 2001. I think it's a Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch papers. Just a few years after, and Competent's already like, it's over. It's still around. It's taken a different form. It's now a many-headed hydra, rather than this very ambitious young dragon as it once was. uh, but what he says in that paper is he's like, look, what we don't want are these untutored surface intuitions, because those intuitions or those judgments on the matter, whether you want to call them intuitions or not, are going to be buffeted by the winds of every type of possible ambiguity and pragmatic implication and misunderstanding of the terminology
Yeah.
that I draw attention to when I look at the empirical research.
Mm,
Uh, and he's like, that's not what we philosophers care about. We
yeah.
care about people's reflective or considered judgments on the matter uh, under certain kinds of hypothesized ideal circumstances. And then he gets into what these circumstances would need to be. Now, I'm not going to be able to recall them exactly, but what he says is he's like, look, if you ask someone this meta-ethical question about whether they have a realist judgment on the nature of morality, what you would want is for them to be competent judges on the matter. So they need to be competent in the language. You wouldn't ask someone that barely knows a particular language or doesn't understand the terms that you're using. Uh, they would need to be, and they would need to be at the very least free of certain sorts of biasing factors that could influence them. And this would include like like pragmatic considerations. So in ordinary discourse, there are all these pragmatic and connotative elements of what a person's saying. As a good example of this, you can imagine two different contexts. So one, uh, you have a realist asking an anti-realist at a philosophy conference who's on the stage, who's just said that they don't think there are objective moral facts. Uh, but they think everyone's committed to this. So they're like, look, so technically I don't think that there are moral facts. You can imagine a realist saying, so you don't think it's wrong to torture, like, you don't think it's quote, wrong to torture babies for fun. And you could see that person on the stage saying, no, I don't think it would be wrong to torture babies for fun. Uh, in that context, the person is making a technical point about language and meaning. And they're saying, I don't technically think it's objectively wrong. That doesn't tell you anything about that speaker's attitudes towards baby torture. I wouldn't be concerned this person's going to like go on a killing spree or be dangerous. They're
Mm,
making a technical philosophical point. But imagine you overheard a conversation on the street, like you're waiting at a crosswalk and someone pushed the button and you're waiting. And someone goes, yeah, I don't think it's wrong to torture babies for fun. I want to call you from that person.
yeah.
That's a scary person. That's a person that is the pragmatics of saying, I don't think it's wrong to X, or you don't mind if people do it. Maybe you would be open to doing it. So in that everyday context, there are implications about what actions you'd be willing to take, what attitudes that you have. What Competent's point is that philosophers are good at partitioning the pragmatic features that we want to peel away from our considered judgments and look just at the pure semantic core of what's being stated and only give a judgment about that. And what he argues, and this is why it's called the rise and fall of experimental philosophy, this is like, look, when you're asking people questions in a survey, they don't have that training, they don't have that knowledge, they don't even know they're supposed to do that. They're responding to the pragmatic features of language. And so their judgments are virtually worthless with respect to saying anything of philosophical interest.
Hmm.
And it's actually philosophers in the armchair who can consider a sentence like, it's wrong to torture babies for fun, and consider the philosophical implications of what's underlying that, what's at stake, and render a more appropriate judgment. Now, I don't think that philosophers have that ability, but I also don't think that non-philosophers do. I think it takes dialectic and discourse. Maybe Kauppinen would agree with that. I think this is more complicated than that. But the point there is that philosophers have addressed this. And I think that they have quite forceful reasons for thinking that experimental philosophy is, it faces an uphill battle to deliver the kinds of responses that would, in fact, be philosophically relevant.
Yeah, it seems that I see the difference that you're drawing there. The idea that you have the philosophers who have the concepts and the ability to think about these things, who are competent judges of these things, at least with respect to the abstract and the concepts and so on. And the everyday person who just doesn't, although they have the pragmatic down. It seems that philosophers, maybe they can get better about the not partitioning the pragmatic away. Maybe we could perhaps get better about thinking about the real world a little bit more. Um, that could be a concern or criticism of philosophers, sure. Um, Now, I wonder though, so with respect to this asking people, it seems that, I'm just thinking off the cuff here. It seems that you can sort of explain why people would have just wide variation in their responses because of just what you said. You may have people who just aren't competent judges of metaethical concepts and theories. And there are some traditions where you have a darkening of the intellect as well. You have people who, through gets into some theistic explanations, but you have people who, through their own actions or their own, maybe I guess psychological terminology would be like willful ignorance of some sort. They just sort of turn off certain parts. And so, if you were to ask them, you have maybe the intellect would assent, but the will is stronger than the intellect. And so it'll win out as sort of, I refuse to acknowledge this, or, human beings are very complex. So it would account for, that is to say, all this variance in the data about what people are saying, even if they did understand the terms. So it seems like asking people on the street would be just a wash in the end anyway. And it makes you wonder why people would care about this project, experimental epistemology, experimental philosophy, going to the streets, asking people. I mean, I can understand the push behind it. And that's what made me wonder, well, if there would be some reasonable, understandable, if possible, some harmony between the philosopher and the person on the street. Let's find a middle ground, that sort of pre-theoretical understanding. But you said that that's been mentioned and it just sort of hasn't worked out, or it's hard, I guess. It's hard to access what one would have thought. I mean, Lance, can you think, well, did I at one time think this, early on, and like, did I change my mind? And then what weight would that carry? You know what I mean? It seems only
Yeah.
in the view of like humor, like his epistemological phenomenal conservatism, it seems like it's a nice start. It's a nice seeming that it sort of gives you this initial prima facie justification, but only it's going to be a subjective justification. You're not going to be able to convince anybody else. And that's kind of it. But as far as like evidential weight in the grand scheme of things, it carries very, very little.
Yeah, I could say my own position on the matter is I don't think that there are, and I'm not even sure it makes sense to talk about there being pre-theoretical views. I see philosophical stances as just being theoretical stances. So to have a pre-theoretical stance on a theoretical question, to me, conceptually, just doesn't make any sense. But you have this like epistemic problem, and the problem is that exactly what you said. Like, you could ask me what I thought before I started studying any particular philosophical question, but I mean, one thing that we know from memory research is how wildly unreliable memory is for certain sorts of things. Now, I can remember my name. There's certainly I
Mhm.
can remember how to do
Yeah.
math. So, one thing that's a check against these sorts of claims. So people say memory is unreliable. What do you mean by that? I mean,
Yeah.
in lots of ways, memory is like absurdly reliable.
Yeah.
If it wasn't useful, we wouldn't have it, and it's certainly reliable enough in many, many contexts. So, uh, there is the question of what it's like. You have to be laser focused in what you're saying it's unreliable for.
Mhm.
One of the things it might not be reliable for is being able to put yourself in the shoes of your past self and to adopt a theoretical perspective to understand more abstractly the theoretical commitments you had prior to seriously considering some theoretical matter. I don't think we're particularly good at that. Even if I think we're good at memorizing math and learning new words and knowing the recent drama at work or in family life or the neighborhood or something. So I want to flag that because when I criticize memory, I don't want to play in to the
Right.
mistaken impression people will give of treating memory like it's this stupid thing that doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
That's fair.
uh, yeah, I don't know what I thought before I thought about these things. And the problem is that, and this is a prime context where people will confabulate. They will come up with
Mhm. Yeah.
some
Yeah.
explanation. They'll tell a story, but who knows if that story is accurate? So,
That's
was I an anti-realist before I considered meta-ethical questions? I don't actually know. And I don't think I'm in a position to know. Now, then the issue becomes if we started asking people about, if we try to get at people's pre-theoretical views, we have a bunch of issues here. One issue is that uh, it would be difficult, if not infeasible, to ask people theoretically laden questions
yeah.
in a way that would how could you get their pre-theoretical view on the matter? One point would just be if you ask the person an open-ended question, are they going to understand you, and how are you going to interpret what they say? If you ask them a bracketed question where you say, "Look, do you endorse position A or position B?"
Mhm.
You're already biasing the person because you're already presenting a
Mm.
sharp categorical distinction between one position and another position. You're excluding the possibility of hybrid views or views external to that particular set of like that particular dichotomy. If I went around saying, "Look, are you a moral realist or a moral relativist?" I would
Mm.
be excluding error theory. I would be excluding non-cognitivism. I
Yeah.
would be excluding hybrid views like David Wong's views. Um, you would already be ruling out options, and that that's you're not soliciting the position that they could have. You're basically putting like the bumpers on a bowling and then saying, "Look
Mm.
how many pins they're hitting." Uh,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
doesn't really work. So I don't know what experimental philosophers can hope to do to address that question.
Mhm.
But then
Yeah.
there's the question of, what if this is a fool's errand? What if they just don't
Right.
have pre-theoretical views? What if you only get a view on the matter once you thought about it?
Right. And that's fair. That I mean, Aristotle will agree with that. You can't become a good harpist unless you picked up a harp. You can't be a bad harpist either unless you've picked up a harp. You can't be good or bad at something that you've never even set, your hands to. But I wonder also, instead of thinking of these pre-theoretical, you're right, it's just a theoretical concept. So you would have to have some theoretical view on it. That makes sense. But I think I use the word pre-theoretical just because it has that assonance in it, pre-phi. But I guess suppose pre-philosophical, before you've thought about philosophy. And let's try to push this a bit further. Um, we know in child development and psychology that your mind is like a steel trap up to like a certain age, right? And you can remember commercials, and you have this nostalgia and this vintage, like when they show up in your social media feed, a certain 90s commercial goes viral, you're like, I remember that. Haven't thought about that in 20, 30 years. But it just traps things in there. And I just wonder, is from an empirical, from a scientific and functionalizable point of view, from a quantitative point of view, it'd probably be really hard to pull that out because it's not functionalizable. It's not quantifiable. Like, how would you set the parameters? Like, how would you know who would be a good judge of their own memory? You know? And then you'd have to know. I mean, they do say like hindsight is 2020, so maybe this would be the best case for asking someone. Like, let's just think about, what they did think at one time. But yeah, that'd be the only way. I don't want to belabor the point, but I thought of that as you were thinking
I
about
should say
memory.
it might not be the only way. So, in principle, I mean, well, there's a couple things to say. One is, in principle, you could look at behavior as a proxy or indirect indicator of a person's views. Now, like say a person says, uh, I don't like pizza. I think pizza is gross and I don't like it. And then, you find out that they order pizza every Friday night and they just scarf it down. They eat a whole pizza. I'm going to start to have questions about whether that person likes pizza or not. Maybe
Yeah.
they could be lying. They could be in deep denial. I hate it. I hate it. And then they just eat it. So you could look at behavior, and people talk about this in I don't know if it's behavioral econ or psychology, but revealed preferences, that you could find out something about what a person prefers by looking at what they do. Look at their purchasing decisions, not just what they say. Um, so in principle, if we could locate a behavioral difference between what we would expect say a realist or an anti-realist to do, or a person that believes in free will or a person that doesn't. If we can operationalize that as some
Yeah.
measurable behavioral outcome, we could look to see if there's behavioral differences. There's going to be confounds and it's going to be difficult,
Yeah.
but it's at least possible, maybe. So I don't want to say that it's a lost cause to try to figure out what people's views are. And I do like the qualification, like pre-theoretical. Okay, shift it over to pre-philosophical.
Yeah.
And I also don't want to be such a skeptical stick in the mud that I don't think that people have any potential commitments or perspectives on matters before studying philosophy. I certainly think that's
Yeah.
possible. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Everyone philosopher in some sense. Yeah.
yeah. And, in my dissertation, I don't say literally zero people that don't have a bachelor's degree or more in
Yes.
philosophy are realists or anti-realists. That would be ridiculous. Of course, there are people that have read philosophy, or there could be a person 10,000 years ago on a lone mountaintop staring up at the starry sky, and they did a little philosophy all on their own and they figured some things out. I don't think people have to have read Plato and Aristotle or some other philosophical tradition to have thought about these questions. I just don't think it's the norm. I think most people don't think about this stuff.
Sure.
So there's that. And then the last thing I'll say about this is keep in mind, I'm coming at this from a metaphilosophical set of presuppositions that some philosophers would reject. So some of them would say, look, when we're talking about the semantic theses, we're not actually making empirical claims. We're not trying to capture the internal psychological processes that are involved when people make a moral judgment. We're trying to capture this, and this is something Walter Sinnott Armstrong says in the paper Mixed Up Meta-ethics. We're trying to capture like an adequate account of the linguistic outputs of their speech patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And he likens this to Chomsky's approach to grammar. And so what we would be looking at are patterns, speech patterns. Like we look at what do people generally say within this language? What's the best sort of external account of what's going on, whether or not that maps onto any particular psychology that's going on in anybody's head. And so there are alternative approaches.
You think it's
Sorry.
irrespective of, I didn't catch because it cut off there, but was it monitor their speech patterns irrespective of whatever's going on internally psychologically?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Why that?
I don't know. It sounds very strange to me.
Very
It
strange.
sounds very strange to think that there are facts about the meaning of sentences that don't have to do with like speaker intent or what people are
Yeah,
using the
exactly.
language for. I think that's weird, but this is a shockingly common view among analytic philosophers. So, I endorse a language's use view. I think that words mean what people mean by the words. But I've been told this is an outrageously controversial view. Okay. But I'm still going to acknowledge that not everybody agrees with that view. So, some philosophers would think that my entire approach to these questions, leaning so much on empirical considerations, is totally out to lunch. So they do exist.
Yeah. No, I don't think that's totally outrageous. Language's use view. I don't think it's completely right either, but we can talk about that another meeting. But I wonder, you made me think about this. So I'm thinking about some, person long ago on a mountaintop thinking about these things. There would also be this claim. I think there's something else I want to talk to you about, Lance, that we didn't mention beforehand, but the idea, and this probably gets into a little bit of convergence argument here too, and a presumption argument, that throughout history, most people have been more relativist. So more realist. Not just the idea that you ask the common person on the bus or the street these things and they will answer a certain way, but present throughout history. And actually, C.S. Lewis has made this argument. He says that, this is in his Abolition of Man book in his first chapter, Men Without Chests. And he argues, he's given this talk, I forget, some lecture or something, some prestigious society, of course. Lewis, for those people who don't know, wasn't just a children's author of Chronicles of Narnia or a popular Christian author of Mere Christianity. He was also a professor of Renaissance and classical English literature and at both Oxford and Cambridge. So he had some literary chops and academic chops. And he argues that if you look at the whole, he wasn't a meta-ethicist, but if you look at all the traditions throughout the world, that they would, no matter their disagreements, so the Aristotelian, the Platonists, if you look at religious tradition, those who believe in the Tao, the Jews who believe in the law, you look at Christians, they all held a sort of, not, he argues for a value objectivism. So this would encompass ethics as well as aesthetics. He includes in there religious claims, any claims of values. He also includes political claims. But he argues that even those people might wildly disagree, let's say, in their normative claims at that level, they would all be in agreement that they are making some claim that is realist in nature. That is, that they're not just so. If you imagine, right? Here's my marker example here. If you look at this and you're like, all right, one group over here says this is our God. This is our God, and he has divine powers. Our idol or something. Our God. This group over here would say, no, that's not a God. Obviously, that's a marker. And so they would have disagreements at the normative level, but they would both be in agreement about their language actually meaning. They're not suggesting that, well, to me, this feels like a God just from my perspective. And then the truth of my statement is just grounded in my preferences and my stance. And it might be different for somebody else, based on their perspective. They're not saying that. That'd be a epistemological difference or difference in perspective, perhaps. But like ontologically speaking, this either really is a God or really is not a God. There's a truth of the matter. And so he argues for this. So what have you seen in anywhere you've read or discussed with respect to sort of like this, not just convergence, not just presumption with respect to what people believe now, but what people have believed over time? I mean, you don't see a lot of psychologists and social psychologists and let's say applied philosophers in metaethics. You don't see them taking into account history prior to the 20th century all that much. That's not really their field. You know what I mean? It's just like the last few decades, the last century or so. That's my understanding anyway. But what do you think about this?
Yeah, I very much agree that philosophers tend to focus too much on what people basically were saying in the 20th century.
Mhm.
So contemporary analytic metaethics. I mean, let's say a few things about that. So metaethics already is it. So metaethics is a branch of ethics that deals with abstract questions about the fundamental nature of morality. Now, that is typically divided in the current discourse between metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. But keep in mind, that categorical distinction between like the three branches of ethics, that wasn't like delivered to us from the mountaintop. That's
Mhm.
something we came up with. That's a human invention.
Do
That
you know
is
when that would have
no, I don't know when people
begun in the
started.
literature? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing you would see in textbooks. I would bet you would see it in the 1980s, and I don't know how
I
much
do
earlier it
think,
would go back.
well, we get natural law tradition from medievals and ancients, and that would be a metaethical position. We get in Protagoras from Plato and his dialogue with Protagoras, we get a relativist position with respect to all truth. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and you
the
do
Jewish
get within
rhythm, yeah,
Western philosophical tradition, you certainly do get hints at
yeah,
meta-ethical positions that look analogous to, and in some ways perhaps quite similar to ones today. Nevertheless, that distinction between meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics is a somewhat recent invention. The distinction between naturalist moral realism and non-naturalist realism,
yeah.
that's very recent. I don't even know if anybody really thought or wrote about or described things in quite those terms. But keep in mind, I'm not a historian of ethics or meta-ethics.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
but it does look like a lot of this started with Principia Ethica with G.E. Moore, which was what, 1902, 1903, like early
Mhm. Right.
1900s. And the entire discourse, at least in terms of the terminology, like the jargon that they use and the way in which the discourse is framed, that's all about 120 years old. It's at most. And that's a fairly recent way of slicing and dicing the conceptual terrain. And it's very easy to impose anachronisms in the
Mhm.
way that we think about metaethics now onto people in the past. Now, that does not mean I'm saying nobody in the past was a moral realist or a relativist.
Mhm.
It does look like some people were. I mean, just take the kinds of remarks by like Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic or something. It's very hard not to see certain metaethical overtones there that
Yeah.
are relevant to and understandable in contemporary
Yeah.
views. At the same time, things like natural law, things like teleological views, those views have fallen out of favor in terms of popular ways of conceptualizing the world. And it's kind of hard for people today to easily get a grip on like a teleological perspective on the world without some degree of training and reading and thinking about how, like, something that might have been
Yeah.
very natural to the way
That's what.
Naples thought about morality, uh, people today would struggle, or how Greeks thought about morality in terms of like virtue ethics. The emphasis on character is
Yeah.
so abnormal compared to 20th century emphasis on actions that it took a popular revival with like Anscombe and other people
Mhm.
to bring virtue ethics back into the fold as a position on the table. Uh, so this we do face some cultural there is some cultural variations, but I do think it's very easy to anachronistically project contemporary understanding of metaethics. And if we want to draw comparisons, compare it to the way contemporary Christian philosophers may struggle not to impose current understandings of the sciences
Mhm.
or philosophy, contemporary analytic philosophy, onto their reading of scripture or onto their reading of the
Mhm.
past. And I think this probably generalizes. Uh, we think in terms of the cultural zeitgeist that we're in, and that heavily skews our perceptions of people in the past. We want to view everyone through the lens of the way that we happen to think about things. And this can cause a lot of problems when we peer back into history. So uh, I don't know how to think about people in the past and how they thought about things. And unfortunately, we can't ask them. So a lot of this, I think, we're going to be stuck remaining speculative about it. But one last point I want to make
Mhm.
about this is, it, you know, even if Lewis was very insightful about the sort of Western trajectory of intellectual thought,
Mhm.
two things are going to be heavily excluded from that. One is the thinking of the everyday person in the ancient world. Uh, what we get a lens through is not a lens into the lives of the typical person. We get a lens into the lives of scholars, of priests and clergy, people that happen to be literate and that happen to be writing things down.
Sure.
And they might talk about what other people thought, but they were not those people, and they were not doing systematic, rigorous surveys to find out about those people. And so we view the historical world, whether it be medieval or the ancient world, um, through a skewed historical lens, and that gives us a limited perspective. And then on top of all of that, keep in mind, like right now today, there's something like 7,000 languages in the world, and
Mhm.
many of these languages are not very closely related to English.
Yeah.
In the past, there were many, many more languages, and they held much more sway over in societies because those languages they did not have borrowed terms from English. Um, Missionaries and explorers have gotten all over the world now, and there's a lot of cultural osmosis. Uh, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that was not the case. Many people stayed in the town they were born in, and they
Mhm.
never interact with other people. People in North and South America weren't interacting with Europeans at all. And so you had wildly different cultures and languages. And when a person is thinking back through history and they think everybody's a realist or everybody's a relativist, they have a very narrow lens through which they're looking. And we have very limited insight into the psychology of people that fall outside the scope of our cultures and who speak very different languages than us.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Honestly, I appreciate the skepticism because you are able to bring in here. I love how sharp your mind is, Lance. And I mean that genuinely because you're able to point out, blind spots that, people wouldn't normally point out or they're thinking of it, but it's very unrefined. It's very, not well articulated and you're able to articulate it very well. So I really appreciate that. But, um, I wonder here if it even matters to ask that, and this gets, you could just modify this sort of presumption argument to, if you were to ask all the philosophers today, then you would just get a philosophical perspective on this. But if you modify to a historical point of view, why widen the scope to your everyday person. Of course, you're not going to have the records for them, but what we might mostly be interested in is the trajectory and trends of the philosophical systems. What were those? And you see this. This is Lewis's point. You see this in Western uh, thought with Judaism, Christianity, Islam. You see it in pagan thought systems, philosophical systems. You see it Stoicism, Epicureanism, and you see this in the East with Hinduism, the Rata. You see it with the Tao, Confucianism. That every single one of these systems, anyway, seem to be this sort of realist perspective on, or assuming some sort of realism with respect to value statements. That they certainly weren't being subjectivist about it. You might think that, now, Lewis didn't have all the categories that you are thinking of in your mind. So I wonder, I don't know if you'd be comfortable with just, analyzing this from the armchair here without having read him, of course, but I wonder if there's a way of accounting for that wouldn't be a realist perspective. You see what I mean? I mean, but I suppose here's an attempt. You could say where there could be universal agreement, it just wouldn't be a realist perspective. It wouldn't be mind independent. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But then again, they had at the normative level, they had a lot of disagreements. So it wasn't a universal agreement. And so what would that universal agreement be about? He's suggesting that it would be this realist position, despite normative disagreements about values, this realist position that they all were presuming that they were meaning and saying things that really applied objectively to the world, that weren't imposing this sort of mind dependence on things. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Kind of chime in here.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to look at exactly what evidence he was presenting to support that. I mean, you're going to have issues of translation. So if I'm translating a text from an Eastern philosophical tradition, if I'm translating something from Sanskrit, or if it's Chinese philosophy or Japanese philosophy or Indian philosophy or any number of other philosophical traditions, who's doing the translating? How are they translating it? You get issues like, for instance, some cultures don't lexicalize moral terms at all. They have different normative conceptions and different normative categories. And when missionaries and scholars and other people went to these places and started interacting and were translating things, people would create you get borrow terms, you get the sort of construction of, like, you mix a couple terms together within the language to create a kind of a constructed, you can introduce the concepts. It's not like people from different cultures, languages are incapable of understanding each other. It's silly. People get way overboard with that kind of thing.
What were they using instead of moral concepts or
It's going to depend on the culture. And I wouldn't even attempt to pronounce the terminology. So I don't know how comfortable I am giving specific examples, but you could look at papers from Renatus Berniunis, and he and some other people have a team of people doing cross-cultural research today, looking at the lexicalization or the lack thereof of certain key terms related to morality and free will in different societies. Dranseca, I think, is another one of the researchers. I wouldn't be able to pull this stuff up right away.
Sure.
But there are people doing this research, and we're talking, this is like after centuries of interaction and exposure. My guess is that if we went back further, that the divides would be quite a bit more stark. So without knowing exactly what Lewis was doing in analyzing these texts, I don't know how accurate those appraisals would be. So I would just express cautious skepticism that he may be seeing something there that may not be there. Now, I'm not going to say it's impossible that people all around the world, when they think about these things, tend to converge on similar philosophical conclusions. But I would just want to actually see what the arguments are and what the evidence for that is. And without looking at it in front of me and, like, taking the time to look at it, I wouldn't be able to judge the matter. What I would say, though, is if I had to take bets on it, I would bet that what we don't have is a clear indication that people all over the world were realists. Now, I should say, if someone says, okay, but that doesn't mean that they thought morality was a matter of personal preference or it was just arbitrary and contingent on your culture, I completely agree. Because keep in mind, I've never said that I think people are relativists. Right. I think people don't have views on the matter one way or another. Right. And that can be a little hard to grok, and like a little hard to internalize. Well,
Sure.
what would that look like if a person doesn't have a meta-ethical view on the matter?
Philosophers presumably would, though, who are writing, but you're saying that would
Maybe, but
be anachronistic,
not.
whatever, because they wouldn't have the categories?
Yeah, well, did philosopher like pick a random philosophical tradition? Did they have a view on whether like A theory or B theory of time is correct? I have no idea.
Yeah,
I don't know.
no. You know, I gave the example of natural law theory. You have that in the scholastic medieval period. Um, you have divine command theory, certainly. You see the Euthyphro, you see a lot of these in Plato. You see Protagoras being a relativist about truth in general. And you mentioned Thrasymachus. Um, Glaucon also is sort of social contract theorist with respect. I think he appears in the Republic. Although it's a normative theory that seems to entail that morality is not real because it's dependent on your culture. I don't know what you think about that, but you do see this sort of pop up in places. So it does, although the terminology, although let's say the carving up of the categories and giving the exact terms, meta ethics, normative ethical theories, applied ethics, and that exact framework isn't apparent until the 20th century, perhaps maybe a little earlier. You do see these concepts and these divisions at least latent within a thinking. So
Yeah, but latent within the thinking of like people in the Platonic tradition, that does not necessarily mean that they were latent in the culture. Now, you might think, well, how would Plato get the idea if it
yeah,
wasn't latent in the culture? That's a good question. But then again, philosophers today come up with categories and distinctions that I've presented empirical evidence are not latent within the culture.
yes,
So
true.
just because philosophers have come up with something doesn't necessarily mean it's reflective of the way that is people typically think or are disposed to think. And the other thing about the philosophical traditions is that they're very much a cumulative enterprise. So how do
Mhm.
we get access like today, you and I, to these sorts of concepts? Well, we've read Plato, we've read Aristotle, we've
Yeah,
read this stuff. So you have this long historical trajectory of us all carrying on the legacy of
yeah,
what previous people thought. But that does not mean that the way that they thought has ever had any substantial uptake in everyday thinking among the populations that they've been a part of.
so
So
that
if
makes
someone wants to make that claim, I would want to see evidence of that claim. So I don't think we're in a position to just assume, you know, Plato and a few other philosophers had, proto meta ethical views, or you could just say out and out meta ethical views. Therefore, the people around them did. I don't know. How would
well,
we
yeah,
find
that's
out?
why I would resist generalizing the scope. Then I would just say, what if you were limited just to philosophical thinkers? And in that
Yeah.
case,
Well.
sort of informed, because here's the thing, like, obviously we have our biases,
Mhm.
of the present age. Any age has their biases, has this sliver of window of history that you're confined in, and things that seem obvious, in the 1940s. Actually, Lewis makes this in another point. He calls it, it's a very short reading called on the reading of old books. And he mentions the difference between Hitler and Roosevelt. And he says there was this unquestioned agreement between the two men. And it was like, what are you talking about? They couldn't be more different. Hitler's Hitler. Roosevelt, I don't know much about his platforms or political views, but I know that he wasn't Hitler. Yes. And so what do you mean they were agreement upon things? But from a 1940s perspective, and he was only writing this very shortly, certainly compared to now, um, they seem to be in unquestioned agreement on a few things. First of all, they had a perspective of being leaders of their nations. They were very nationalistic. They both supported eugenics. They both supported concentration camps, not execution camps, but concentration camps to concentrate population. And so, take eugenics, for example. This is just in the 40s and prior, all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. It was just seen as just obvious. Like, obviously, you don't want to pass on bad genes. So it seems like each age is going to be confined. So it seems like there might be some value. This is a takeaway in, even if we can't get to the everyday person throughout history, because not everybody was a writer, not everybody was an author. Now you got people just being on Twitter and everybody sharing their opinions, but you have the philosophers, you have the thinkers, you have the writers throughout history, and it seems to, when you compare that, that seems to be a really interesting data set of information. Now, what to do with that information? They all, of course, you have to argue that the argument here would be, of course, you'd have to argue for this and support it, that they would be all realists, of course. and that would need support, further support. But it seems like if that were true, it would provide this interesting evidence, let's say. What value do you think that evidence would be?
There'd be some
Supposing
value
it
in that.
wouldn't be all more relativist.
Yeah, if you had a bunch of independently developed philosophical traditions from around the world, and they did turn out to reliably converge on most of them being realists in these different philosophical traditions, I would take that as a data point. I already take it as a data point that most philosophers in the Western tradition are realists, as some evidence of realism. But that, there's a bunch of questions you could ask about that, which is, and I've written about this, on my blog. I have this thing I call the fill papers fallacy, which effectively comes down to putting too much stock into what most philosophers at a particular time happen to think. I mean, keep in mind, that same survey finds something like 80% of philosophers that responded to the survey are atheists. Is that good evidence of atheism? Not really. I don't take what most philosophers happen to think to be strong evidence, because ultimately what matters is why they think it.
Mhm. Right.
But independent cultures all converging on a similar philosophical view, I would take that to be quite interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not in a position to assess those claims, though, so I wouldn't know whether they've converged on realism or not. Maybe Lewis has good evidence of that. Maybe he doesn't. I really don't know.
Yeah.
I would want to start talking to people that are experts in those philosophical traditions,
Mhm.
because what am I going to read? Some English translation from a Western philosopher that's looked at, like,
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
know how biased that's going to be. So, on the other hand, um, a point I kind of want to make about this is, one reason to be very skeptical that people in the past were, and again, I'm not talking about regular people, I'm talking about philosophers. Uh, One reason to be very skeptical that they themselves definitively came down on the realist or anti-realist side of things is to look at the current discourse in contemporary metaethics in the English-speaking Anglophone philosophy world right now. So we get that narrow slice of
Yeah.
the philosophical pie. The question would be, do those philosophers have a good handle on what's metaethically at stake? Now, this is maybe a bit of a hot take, but I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
Look, one of the most common things I have to do as an anti-realist is argue not just with like lay people and people in online debate spaces, but with professional philosophers themselves about what the implications of relativism are. So I'll give one example. I routinely see, again, this is professional philosophers. They'll say stuff like, well, if you're a moral relativist, then you have no business complaining if someone tries to steal your wallet, because if they're trying to steal your wallet, then you would have to agree that it's good for them to do so because they consider it permissible. Or they'll say, if some other culture wants to do human sacrifice, you'd have to be okay with that. Uh, that might be true if you're an agent relativist. And again, I say might be true,
Mhm.
but at best, it's only going to be true if you're an agent relativist, not if you're an appraiser relativist. And yet, when I see these critiques, they just say relativism and then relativism refuted. I mean, that would be like saying, because I've refuted, Calvinism, I've refuted Christianity. That doesn't follow. Refuting a particular Christian tradition doesn't refute the whole thing. Likewise, refuting a specific form of relativism doesn't refute relativism as a thing. You would have to refute appraiser relativism as well. And yet I see very little nuance, very little careful attention to drawing out the distinction, and very little ability to specifically target and critique appraiser relativism. It
Mhm.
seems like many experts or, putative experts don't appear to be aware of the distinction, or they're so negligent or irresponsible they don't care. And again, this is people that have all of the resources, terminology, equipment, and tools available
Mhm.
to be aware of it, and they
Yeah.
still don't do it. And when I've encountered some of them, they're obstinate about this. They don't want to grapple with appraiser relativism. So I
Yeah.
deal with people that, and if I'm just being blunt, are stubborn, dogmatic, not well informed, and they literally have PhDs and super duper training in the topic, and they still do a bad job. But I'm to believe people that didn't have access to any of those resources, any of the distinctions, or any of the terminology, they had a handle on this. I'm very skeptical of that, because it doesn't look to me like most people have a very good
Yeah,
handle on
have
anti-realism today.
a lot of the distractions we have today. That's I can think through much more deeply about these things. There's that, but you bring up the appraiser and agent relativism distinction, and I have been thinking about that. Now, I am guilty of this. I'm not an expert in metaethics. I'm not an expert in normative ethical theories. I do dabble in virtue ethics. I'm very informed by that tradition, of course. Um, and I take the realist position with respect to metaethics, but as for knowing all the landscape of all these things, I'm still learning, of course. And so in my video, that we originally started with. It was simply a lesson that I would normally give in class, and I made this error, although not being an expert. I even failed to mention the distinction between the appraiser and agent, because at the time I didn't even know that there was such a distinction. But upon learning of it, I'm not sure if I buy the distinction, to be frank with you. I think it sort of just collapses into just being the same thing, because at some point, here's why. I just basically at some points I will be an appraiser, and some points I will be the agent, depending on whether I'm doing an action or not. And if I'm an agent, most likely I'm going to be also appraising my takes. And so all that seems to be describing to me is like, from whose perspective are we evaluating these things? And that's epistemic more than anything. It's not an ontological difference. And it doesn't seem to really do much for me to put forth that distinction. And so, yeah, I'm not sure I really understand it. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think this distinction is very important. One thing to note is that in many cases, the appraiser is the agent, and that's not a
Right.
problem. I mean, this is something that would already be acknowledged and absorbed into the characterization of the views.
Mhm.
So, like, let's say I decide I'm going to lie to somebody, and someone goes, "Well, don't you think what you're doing is wrong?" And I go, "No." Well, I'm the appraiser of my own actions, and I'm the agent performing the action. But that's not a problem. Uh, the issue for the distinction, it has to do with whether you're only concerned with normative evaluation, well, sorry, I shouldn't say normative. Well, if you're an agent relativist, there's going to be some normative considerations here. But uh, whether you're only focused on evaluating the agent in question, or whether you're evaluating things from an appraiser-centric perspective. Now, the way that that works would be, if you're an agent relativist, and we could focus on the cultural one first, and then we could look at the individual one. If you're an agent relativist, a cultural agent relativist, here's what you think. You think that each culture determines what's right or wrong. They legislate what's right or wrong for that culture. And then that, in a way, makes that action right. And then it makes it right or wrong in a way that has normative moral implications for everybody else.
That I should just accept. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're a cultural agent relativist, if the culture right over there, like, let's say tomorrow Canada decides to vote that they're going to pass a law saying human sacrifice is really, really important, and it's okay to do human sacrifice every Friday evening now. Uh, if you're an agent relativist, you'd be like, all right, well, at least you'd be committed to this. Maybe you would be inconsistent with your actions,
Right.
but you'd be committed to thinking, oh, well, it's good for Canada to do that human sacrifice. Now, if you're an appraiser relativist,
Wait,
you're not committed to that.
looking good there. You mean it's just consistent that with agent relativism that they're doing such a thing? It's coherent, and I have no objection. I can't object to this, I guess, would be the entailment.
You know what? I'm not entirely clear what an
Yeah.
agent relativist would say to all this stuff. One of the reasons why is I've never met an agent relativist. I don't know anybody that has a really philosophically robust and thought out commitment to the view. Um, to me, this is a bit of a caricature of folk relativism, because you'll run
Right.
into students that'll say, well, if it's in part of their culture, then it's okay for them to do it. Um, and that's an agent relativistic kind of perspective. But I think what everybody's noticed, what I think you've probably seen this, I've certainly seen this, is when you start pressing students on this, they usually fold real quick. They'll be like,
Yeah.
oh, well, but not in my culture. They get all these weird inconsistencies and problems when anybody tries to be consistent about their hands-off attitude towards other cultures. You could certainly find subcultures or communities or practices. Because take those students that say we shouldn't judge that culture over there. Ask them whether they think slavery in the 1800s of the United States is okay. And a
Right.
lot of them will be like, hell no, that was totally wrong. Like, but it was a different culture in the past. Why wasn't it okay then? So you'll find this. So if we're talking about agent relativism as it manifests as a folk view, it's going to be this internally incoherent, indefensible mess.
Mhm.
And I'm
Mhm.
100% on the page of realists that criticize that type of relativism. But if you want to try to convert it into a at least somewhat more philosophically respectful or respectable view, you're going to have quite the challenge. So here would be an issue. Let's say you're an agent relativist at the individual level, and you're acting on your standards, and you think it's good for you to do so, and someone else is acting on their standards, and it's good for them to do so, and they come up to you and say, hand over your wallet. Now, you are committed to thinking it's morally permissible for them to demand your wallet, but what if you think I have a moral obligation to protect myself from harm and injury and try to preserve my life? So now it's morally correct for you to defend yourself, but it's morally correct for them to take your wallet. So what are you supposed to
Yeah.
do?
Right.
Because what if they then said, hey, not only do I think it's morally permissible for me to steal your wallet, on my view, it's morally wrong for you to resist me stealing your wallet. Okay, so now you have to agree it's good for them it's good for them to hold the view that it's wrong for you to resist, and you're obligated to resist. So now you both are obligated to resist and not resist. What do you do? Whose actions do you act on? So the view, I think, runs into some problems. I don't know how agent relativists resolve those problems. I think there's an issue there. So if you start having this view that, or take another view that you could have. So Canada enacts the policy, human sacrifice is morally good, but in your culture, you have an obligation to invade other cultures that try to carry out human sacrifice and stop them from doing so. Now what? Which practice do you respect? So I don't know how agent relativists are supposed to resolve those conflicts. I'm not an agent relativist. It's very hard for me to adopt that framework because I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But appraiser relativism does not have that problem. Appraiser relativism, in a very straightforward reductive form, is a way of viewing what is meant by a moral claim. And in a sense, it reduces moral claims to a certain type of descriptive claim. So the appraiser relativist would say, look, when members of that culture say it's okay for us to carry out human sacrifice, you can understand the sentence to be something like, our culture approves of engaging in human sacrifice. And then that statement would in fact be trivially true. It is in fact true that cultures that approve of human sacrifice are cultures that approve of human sacrifice. That's true. But no, that's a descriptive claim. It doesn't have any normative implications for you or for me, or it doesn't tell anybody what they should or shouldn't do. So then that frees you up as an appraiser relativist to take any stance on that you're inclined to take. You could be opposed to it. You could be in favor of it. You could say, yeah, I'll join your human sacrifice. Or you could say, hey, I'm going to stop you. And those are both consistent. So appraiser relativism gets rid of these like conflict issues that agent relativism has. It gets rid of the normative implications of the view. You're not obligated as an appraiser relativist to respect other people's practices or cultures. So when you wouldn't have to respect the human sacrifice in Canada, and when a person demands your wallet, as an appraiser relativist, you could agree they think it's okay to take your wallet, right? You think it's not okay for them to take your wallet, and you could do anything you want at that point. You could resist. You could hand over your wallet. And so it doesn't have the normative implications that agent relativism has that makes it such a problem. And so when people critique agent relativism, they don't critique it by saying, hey, the semantic thesis is wrong. When people make moral claims, they're not attempting to make relative claims. They critique it because of this normative issue that it runs into. But appraiser relativism does not have that issue. So that's what concerns me about the critique, is that the critique is only applicable to agent relativism. It's not applicable to appraiser relativism. And no one focuses on that. I don't know if that clarifies things or helps.
It does a little. And I think it's just a matter between switching perspectives. And I think, like, from my position, from my perspective is teaching this in the classroom, I will see students, understandably, because you kind of modify as you're hearing objections and you're working through issues, especially if you have this own inchoate understanding to begin with, and you're sort of exploring these things for the very first time. You're going to be like, well, I don't know about that. And so I see it as rhetorically useful to make this distinction. And I see it as like an epistemic distinction, between the agent and the appraiser, describing whose perspective the evaluation is happening. But I don't see further value in that. It's not as if I should say this. The only view of relativism that I really think is relativism is a meta-ethical relativism. I don't really think descriptive relativism is true relativism. It's just, hey, other cultures have, the cultures have different ethical views. Like that doesn't seem like a relative, not in like a robust sense anyway. I can understand, technically speaking, it's a relativism, if you just want to use the technicality of that word. But I think it's, knowing that the word has its loaded usage, it would seem infelicitous to use it there. And so in the same way, like this, to call this sort of like a different version of relativism, it seems to be a little infelicitous to me, but that's just my take.
Yeah, well, to be clear, appraiser relativism is a meta-ethical view. It's not the descriptive relativism. So descriptive relativism is not, I would agree, I don't even think it's a real type of relativism. Descriptive relativism is the observation that different people have different moral standards. That's not what appraiser relativism is. Appraiser relativism does have a metaphysical thesis, which is that there are no stance-independent or non-relative moral facts. Well, I should say, technically, it's a view that there's no non-relative moral facts, but it moves from a view about moral semantics to this sort of like, well, it doesn't necessarily entail a descriptive view. You could be an appraiser relativist even if there's one person. There would be no actual descriptive variation. So appraiser relativism ultimately is really just a view about moral semantics and the metaphysical implications of that, which puts
Mhm.
it squarely in the realm of contemporary analytic metaethics as a metaethical view. Because keep in mind, that's exactly what error theory and
I
naturalist
understand
realism.
that. I understand that.
Naturalist realism is a view largely that focuses on semantics.
Yeah.
So it's not my fault. Like if you think, hey, this appraiser relativism, if it just reduces moral claims to these descriptive views, it's totally stepping out of the
Oh,
realm of what any sort of practically robust and philosophically relevant or interesting view. It's just this weird view about words.
I didn't mean to
I make
suggest
the same of
that.
naturalist realism, but I didn't pick the categories. It's
Right.
analytic philosophers that decided that these are all meta ethical views.
Yeah.
If all these views end up being these hollow husks that are just goofy ways of using words, okay, I might just agree with you about that, but they still fall into those categories, like
Yeah.
as far as like how it's framed in the discourse. But keep in mind, I'm a critic of that discourse. I
Yeah.
don't think we
Yeah.
should frame things in this way. I don't
Yeah.
even like the realism to say realism distinction. I don't think it's the right way to
Mm.
frame things. And
Yeah.
I've written about this. I've said on my blog, I think we should abandon that distinction and that there's other more conceptually and practically important distinctions that we could focus on. Like for me, it would be irreducible normativity. It wouldn't be
Yeah.
realism, anti-realism.
Let me try to clarify what I meant. So I
Okay.
didn't suggest that appraiser, let alone agent relativism, was a descriptive relativism. I wasn't suggesting that at all. I think so long as they're understood correctly, of course, they'd be metaethical relativism. I was just using that as an example. In the same way, I wouldn't think of descriptive relativism as like a real robust relativism, not in the real sense that most people mean by relativism, with its with its pragmatic entailments. I don't think I'd say the same thing about appraiser versus agent, the way I understand it currently. Anyway, I think it's more having to do, although I acknowledge, like I said, that it is properly understood within that category, the way it's being used, but the way it's being used, I don't see much value in it other than like, here's the difference between them. They're both relativism. The only difference between them, it seems to me, is a perspective switch. And then the things that are entailed by that. So I'll give you an example. So I have a paper I co-authored a couple of years ago on Acadia or Acedia, the deadly sin of sloth, in the writings of Kierkegaard. And it's called Perspectival Acadia. And we argue that throughout his writings, not only does he use this tradition of the deadly sins, he mentions Acadia, not in those words, but he mentions that old deadly sin that's laziness, slothfulness, and so on. And he mentions it from, he has three different spheres of living, three different spheres. You have the aesthetic, you have the ethical, and you have the religious sphere. And these take place in like such writings like either or, fear and trembling, and so on. And so it is going to look different. It's going to manifest differently. Phenomenologically, it will feel differently in this sphere, one sphere versus the other sphere, based on one's perspective. So I will feel slothfulness if I'm in the aesthetic sphere, for example. I'm really harnessed, shackled by my passions, and I'm going to follow those things that I really, really love. And so sloth for me is going to look and feel a certain way that it won't feel for somebody in the ethical sphere or in the religious sphere who are a little bit higher up in sort of their development and maturity, let's say. So it does have entailments, but that doesn't mean like it has pragmatic entailments, practical entailments. But I don't think want to say that it's now a different vice. You know what I mean? Like it still has its characteristic, you know, identifiable syndrome or symptoms that you can identify in anyone, but the way in which it manifests will of course look differently depending on the perspective. They'll have the pragmatic intelligence. So that's a corollary. That's a parallel of what I'm suggesting here. That maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but back to what I said before. But it seems that the only difference is that they're both relativism. It's just a perspective switch. Is that a correct way of thinking about that?
I mean, they're different in their semantic content. They're different in their normative implications. So I think that the views are different. They treat it, so while they both involve indexing, that's what ultimately makes them a type of relativism. agent relativism appears to have fairly realist-like qualities in terms of what it appears to commit people to.
Mm.
Keep in mind, with an agent relativist, uh, part of what I find, in fact, I've actually jokingly called it a la carte realism, because think
Yeah.
about what the agent relativist thinks. The agent relativist thinks each culture or each person, like in virtue of their attitudes, preferences, or values, they legislate the moral facts of themselves. And then those facts, in a certain sense, become true in a way that is normatively binding on other people. And so, in a certain sense, if you're an agent relativist, you think that there are moral facts about what you should or shouldn't do that don't depend on your attitudes, preferences, or values. And those are actionable. They are normatively efficacious. You're supposed to comply with them independent of your goals and standards. Just like realism, which holds that there's moral facts that don't depend on your attitudes or values.
Mm.
The only difference is that for the agent relativist, instead of them not depending on anybody's attitudes or values at all, like in the case of the realist, they do depend. They just depend on other people's values, but they're still binding on you. And so, to the extent that you're an agent relativist, you may hold very realist-like views like, well, because that culture has this practice, I have an obligation, irrespective of my culture or my values, to respect it.
Mm.
And so now I'm saddled with normative obligations that are not reducible to my attitudes or preferences. This is not the case for the appraiser relativist. For the
Mm.
appraiser relativist, you can and you could find this even more objectionable. You can do whatever you want. There's no rule imposed from the outside. And so appraiser relativism, if you want to argue about which one's a type of relativism, I think there's a case to be made that appraiser relativism is the quote unquote truer relativism
Mhm.
because it fully purges the external imposition
I see.
vibe that realism and agent relativism have, and leaves you with a fully, it's up to you what you want to do. There's no outside or external forces impinging on you. So in that sense, I think it has different normative implications. So is it a perspective switch? Yes, it is, but it's not just that. I think things follow from that actually are. I mean, it's a rare case where I think it's actually practically relevant. I mean, I'm all
Yeah.
about quietism and saying these distinctions rarely matter. This is a rare case where I think they do matter.
Yeah. I wonder if that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. That helps. But I think that's what I meant by that pragmatical entailments in that perspective switch. So that helps me to understand a little bit more. But I wonder if you get the collapse from a different perspective, from a different, well, for lack of a better term, from a different angle, let's say. Because for the agent relativists, they're just going to believe that whatever that culture over theirs views are, I should respect them, or maybe not, but it's just going to be that internal tension if I don't respect them, of course. But they have their own views, and they're going to have views that maybe have to do with me, and I should respect them. But it seems like you could say, well, the agent relativist also, just like the appraiser relativist, similar to him, in this respect, the agent relativist is sort of like in this solipsistic scenario now. He only has to be bound, let's say, by other cultures, moral codes, moral principles based on how he understands them. So that would still be from his own perspective. So that would be, again, I think that may be that collapse that I was referring to, the idea that he's the appraiser of, so insofar as he understands them in this specific way, these other cultures' perspective. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense here?
Yeah, but I don't think
We're
that that's a
bound by
distinctive
that,
issue for.
and then in that sense, he is the appraiser of these other cultures. But of course,
Yeah,
like, he's not saying from my perspective, but like he's in some way trapped inside his own head. Like,
but yes, but I would say that that's no less true of a moral realist, because as a moral realist, you can only act on what you believe the stance independent moral facts are.
right.
You're
That's what I'm
still,
getting back to from criticisms you had made about moral relativism. I think they would be applicable here.
yeah, I just think that there's just an epistemic question,
Mm.
and that they're saddled with the same sort of issue anybody else would be saddled with. So I don't think that that would be a distinctive problem for agent
Is it
relativism.
not? rem- Does it not in some way mark a similarity here with appraiser relativism because he is appraising them? Well, he's not making a judgment about them, but he's in some way filtering them through his own understanding. So it depends on what
Uh,
praiser. If you mean by praiser that you're a judge of these other ones, and you're saying, no, I judge mine to be correct, and I like mine the most, then of course that would be. But yeah, so
Yeah, I wouldn't hinge too much on the terminology behind the
Mhm.
names and try to read off implications based on that. Yeah, there's going to be epistemic access issues whenever you're making judgments about the moral positions and beliefs of other societies. But this is going to be true for every metaethical position. Like if you're a realist, you're going to have to think, okay, well, if there are stance independent moral facts, I may or may not have any direct access to them. Some types of moral realism are going to get around this. They may claim to be directly acquainted with what the moral facts are, or they might claim that they're self-evident, so they wouldn't have an epistemic problem. Uh, but one thing to say about that is, uh, if agent relativists were correct, then you would just have that problem. It wouldn't make a position false. So you'd want to be careful about saying, hey, like, okay, well, the fact that there's certain facts about chemical interactions that we might not like
yeah,
certainly doesn't make the present construction of the periodic table
yeah,
false. So we always want to be careful not to fall into the mishap of mistaking intuitions about what's plausibly the case or not with a straightforward appeal to consequences. I'm not, and by the way, I'm
yeah,
not suggesting at all that you're doing that, but
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm wary of giving people the conceptual resources to
yeah,
reject meta ethical positions for bad reasons. And this is something that David Pullman has said when we discuss things. It looks to him like a lot of objections to relativism are an appeal to consequences. Like you will see people say, but if relativism were true, it would be chaos. Okay, well, it is chaos. That doesn't make things false. So we do want to be careful about that. Um,
yeah,
I don't know how much we should. Well, I think this distinction is important, but the original point I was making though was simply that. Um, you know, you've come here, and by the way, sorry if I mistook you talking about appraiser relativism as descriptive relativism. I
oh, that's okay,
misunderstood you
totally
to be
okay.
saying it was descriptive.
Maybe my fault. It's totally fine.
Yeah, but well, that was my mistake. So sorry about doing that.
That's all right.
So my original point in drawing attention to this distinction, whether we could dispute how important the distinction is. I mean, it was just an example of
Yeah,
what I perceive among contemporary analytic philosophers, which is generally speaking, even ones that comment on meta ethics will exhibit misunderstandings of the relevant
yeah,
positions. And again, like uh, a lot of this is coming from people that are supposed to be experts on the topic. Now, again, that's a bit of a hot take from me.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I think some of them are going to find that objectionable or offensive. But what I routinely encounter, you can see it in some of my recent blog posts, are realists that seem to struggle to understand things from the anti-realist perspective. So they'll say stuff like, but if it's just a matter of preference, why would you care? And
yeah,
it's like, why would I not care about my preferences? And I'll give people analogies, and I'm like, look, you have food preferences. If
yeah,
if you go to the restaurant and you order some food that you really like, and they serve you a plate of garbage, would you say, well, because there's no gastronomic facts about what food is tasty independent of my preferences, I'm just going to eat this disgusting garbage? Why would you do that? And I would have hoped people go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you could care about your subjective preferences because they affect your happiness and your well-being. Now, you could say, but I don't think that's enough. And I don't think morality is like that. But I would at least hope people can understand the point of view. And I genuinely see that people struggle to even understand. Sorry, that people struggle to even understand anti-realism. So my point about that was, if specialists today, with all the conceptual tools, resources, education, and knowledge available to them, struggle to understand the anti-realist perspective, it's hard for me to believe with confidence that people in the past were reliably realists when if they themselves don't seem to have a good grip on the distinction.
yeah.
Does that make
That
sense?
totally makes
I'm
sense. Yeah,
not asking
yeah,
if you agree. I'm just trying to get the
yeah.
point.
No, it totally makes sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'd like to think more. We may not have the time now, but what you just mentioned with respect to how strongly you believe, and I forget how you just phrased it there, but having a vested interest in these things, and that yeah, I forget how you phrased it just there, but that gets into another topic that I wanted to. We may have to do it another time, unfortunately, but thinking about from a subjectivist point of view, my personal values. And that I'd be deeply interested in things with respect to that objection. Why would you care? if you're not a realist about these things. So I'd love to explore that more, but maybe short on time here, Lance, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Um,
we got to wrap up now?
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. This is a good time.
Yeah.
I always say to people, after an hour and a half, I start running out of steam anyway.
Oh, yeah. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you and all the work that you are consistently doing. It's really great, man. Keep it up. I can tell you've got like a really fervent following, and people really love what you're doing as well. This is not just me talking. So awesome job on that. And maybe someday I'll get around to reading your dissertation on these things too.
It's kind of
Look,
long. I will
yeah.
say, I did do one discussion specifically focused on that on Joe
Ooh,
Schnitt's channel, Majesty of Reason.
okay,
You can
yeah,
check out that discussion where I get
cool,
into the more of the details of that.
awesome, good, cool. Well, I appreciate your time, and we will have to schedule something a lot sooner than between now and last time. It's been like 3 days.
Yeah. And whoa, I was about to say something I shouldn't have said. I'll mention it after. Okay, so let's do it. Yeah, I'm happy to have another
Great.
conversation soon.
Cool.
But with that, yeah, thanks so much for being here. I really like discussing things with you. It feels very low pressure.
Of
I don't feel
course,
like I'm in
yeah,
this
yeah,
debate space where if I
yeah.
slip up, you're going to do a gotcha and get me, and that's
Not at
a
all.
nice
No.
context to have a discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate this speed of things as well. I know I sort of uh clickbaited the debate on my channel. It wasn't a debate at all. And I think somebody commented, they're like, "This is not a debate." And I was like, "You're right."
I don't mind the clickbait. People
Yeah.
got to get the
Yeah.
views.
Yeah. So
All right, everybody.
cool.
So I'll leave a link in the description to your channel for people to go
Mhm.
check it out. What's the name of your channel?
It's just at Derek L. McAllister.
All right.
My
So go check
username.
that out.
Yeah.
I'll leave a link in the
Yeah.
description,
Please do.
and we'll leave it there until next time. We'll be doing a part 3.
All right. Sounds great. I see you again.
Take care, everybody.